I always thought I knew what remote meant. I'd done plenty of solo hikes before, weeks in the Ozarks, a winter stint in the Sawtooths, even spent a few nights in Big Bend without seeing another soul. But nothing prepared me for Coldwater Basin. No, I don't expect you to find it on a map. You won't. Hell, I only learned about it from a retired Forest Service guy named Len I met at a gun show in Reno back in early 2019. We were both looking at the same used lever-action 308 and ended up talking over bad gas station coffee afterward. When I mentioned I was looking for an isolated place to camp and shoot without the usual "you're scaring the hikers" crap, his eyes went quiet. "There's a basin east of the Sierra line," he said eventually, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Not on the rec maps. Locals stay away." I leaned in, intrigued. "Why's that?" His weathered face tightened. "They say the wind's wrong there." He took a long sip of his coffee. You go out. You go out quiet. And don't ask what you're not ready to know." I thought he was full of it. Just another old-timer clinging to whatever weird mountain legends hadn't been buried by time yet. But he seemed genuine enough to share his hand-drawn map, marking the route with a trembling finger. "Follow the old mining road past Juniper Ridge until it forks at a lightning-struck pine. Left takes you into Sawmill Canyon. Right goes to Coldwater." He hesitated, then added, "Nobody's maintained those trails in decades. Might not even be passable anymore." That should have been my first warning, the way he spoke of the place like he was describing a grave rather than a camping spot. But the challenge of finding somewhere truly off-grid appealed to me. Somewhere pristine, untouched, my own private wilderness. "What's out there that's got everyone spooked?" I asked, half joking. Len didn't smile back. "Nothing to worry about if you keep to yourself and don't go poking around where you shouldn't." He drained his coffee. "Just don't stay after dark if the birds go quiet." I laughed it off. Mountain people and their superstitions. Always making nature into something mystical when really it was just indifferent. 2 months later, I found myself navigating that half-erased trail with his hand-drawn map in my lap, chewing beef jerky and praying my Tacoma didn't rattle apart on the rocks. It was early May, still cool at night, bone dry during the day. The kind of weather you dream about for backcountry. And I'd planned every damn detail. 2 weeks off-grid. A satellite SOS beacon. My rifle. Enough freeze-dried meals to feed a platoon. And just me. That was the plan. What I got instead was something no amount of preparation could have readied me for. The further I drove, the more the world peeled away. Cell service disappeared first, then radio signals faded to static. The road thinned out, turned to gravel, then dirt. Around the last bend, even the trees gave up. Just jagged rocks and gray dust, like the land had been burned clean. I parked under a rock overhang for shade and stepped out into silence. I don't mean peace and quiet silence. I mean dead silence. No wind, no bugs. Not even the high-pitched whine you get in your ears when it's really quiet. Just nothing. A vacuum where sound should be. I tried to shake it off, grabbing my pack and locking the truck. The hike in would be about 6 miles according to Len's map, following a dried-up creek bed and a ridgeline. I shouldered my pack, checked my GPS one last time, knowing it wouldn't help much once I was deeper in, and headed out. The sun hung overhead like a convection oven, baking the landscape into shimmering waves of heat. I kept to the narrow game trail, stepping carefully over loose rocks and thorny brush. My boots raised small clouds of dust with each step, the only movement in an otherwise motionless landscape. 3 miles in, I spotted the landmark Len had mentioned, a massive pine split down the middle by lightning. Half of it was blackened from the strike, the other half somehow still alive, green needles clinging to gnarled branches. It felt like a warning someone had nailed into the dirt. "Follow the left fork," I muttered to myself, recalling Len's instructions. 2 more miles to the basin. That's when I noticed the first weird thing. Animal bones scattered along the trail. Not unusual in itself, nature's cleanup crew is efficient. But these weren't old. They still had dried sinew attached, tufts of fur here and there. And they weren't chewed. No bite marks, just torn. Like something had pulled them apart systematically. I knelt down, examining a section of what looked like deer vertebrae. The breaks were clean, almost surgical. No predator I knew hunted like this. Probably just fell from a height, I reasoned aloud, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. Hit the rocks and broke apart. But deep down, I knew better. Animals that fall don't disassemble like puzzles. As the trail descended into the basin proper, the scattered bones became more frequent. I found myself stepping over rib cages, leg bones, fragments of skull, all showing the same peculiar separation, like they'd been dismantled rather than consumed. Then came the deer. I found it maybe a quarter-mile from where I eventually set up camp, lying half submerged in a patch of red dirt. No blood, no flies. Its neck was bent too cleanly, like someone had snapped it. Its eyes were gone, but not pecked out, removed. The sockets were weirdly clean. I didn't want to admit how much that shook me. The rational part of my brain tried to provide explanations. Mountain lion, humans hunting illegally, maybe even a bear. But none of those explanations fit what I was seeing. Still, I pressed on, finally reaching the basin itself around mid-afternoon. It was beautiful in a stark, alien way. A broad, flat expanse surrounded by jagged rock formations that rose like broken teeth against the sky. A perfect, natural amphitheater. At the far end, a small cluster of trees offered the only shade. I made camp there, forcing myself to follow the motions. Tent staked near a rock wall for wind cover, even though there hadn't been a breath of air all day. Fire pit dug and ringed with stones. Water filtered from the small spring I'd found trickling from a rock face. Rifle loaded and cleaned. Night was coming, and with it, the sense that I hadn't found this place at all. It had allowed me to enter. By sunset, the sky lit up in oranges and deep purple. I roasted a pouch of chicken teriyaki and sat by the fire, feeling my nerves settle a little. The shadows grew longer, creeping across the basin floor like living things, but the flames kept them at bay. I had my rifle, my knife, my emergency beacon. I was prepared. Or so I thought. That first night was calm on the surface. No wind, just the stars watching from above, impossibly bright without light pollution. I left the rain fly off the tent and lay there watching satellites blink overhead, picking out constellations, anything to keep my mind from returning to that deer with its empty eye sockets. At some point, I drifted off, lulled by exhaustion and the stillness of the night. Then I heard it. Not a noise exactly, more like a presence. I bolted upright, heart hammering against my ribs. The fire had died to coals, casting an orange glow across the campsite. My rifle was still beside me, untouched. I scanned the dark, straining my eyes against the gloom. Nothing. I clicked on my headlamp and did a slow circle around the camp. Flashlight in one hand, rifle in the other. No tracks in the dust, no movement in the brush, not even a stirred-up bit of earth to suggest something had passed by. It was just a dream, I whispered, voice wavering. Had to be. I crawled back into the tent, laid there staring at the nylon roof, eyes wide, waiting. I couldn't name what I was waiting for, but it was there, the certainty that something was coming. Then I felt it, the sensation of being watched, not imagined, not anxiety. It was there, tangible as the ground beneath me. Something was perched on the edge of the dark, watching, waiting for me to close my eyes again. I didn't. I stayed awake until the sun started bleeding into the sky. Rifle across my chest, ears attuned to every crack and rustle. But nothing came. And when daylight finally arrived, the feeling vanished like smoke. I should have left then. Packed up, walked away. But I didn't. Because I hadn't even fired the damn rifle yet. Because I'm an idiot who thought fear was something you could ignore if you acted tough enough. and because I still thought I was alone out there. I wasn't. And the next day was going to prove that in ways I still can't forget. The second morning came with a sky so clear it almost looked fake. That impossible desert blue that seems to go on forever. I rolled out of my tent slowly, every muscle stiff from sleeping in a half-alert sprawl. My eyes felt gritty, burning from lack of rest. The fire had burned down to a pile of gray ash, and the air had that dry, charged stillness that always comes right before a storm. But there were no clouds, just heat and silence. I made coffee, forced down a granola bar, and tried to shake off the unease from the night before. I'd managed to convince myself that the rustling I heard outside the tent was just an animal. A fox, maybe, or even a deer, curious about the smell of food. Nothing worth panicking over. But the truth was I hadn't slept. Not really. I kept waking up every 20 minutes, heart thudding, convinced someone or something was standing just beyond the edge of the firelight. I thought about packing up. There was still time to hike out before the sun got too high, before the heat made the return trip brutal. But then I looked at the rifle resting beside my pack and told myself I was overreacting. I'd come out here to shoot, to clear my head. I wasn't about to leave just because I got spooked by some twigs snapping in the dark. After breakfast, I decided to explore the basin further. Maybe familiarizing myself with the terrain would ease my nerves. I grabbed my day pack, some water, my rifle, and set out toward the southern rim. The basin floor was a mosaic of red dirt, scrub brush, and small rock formations. Nothing moved in the heat. No birds, no lizards. Even the insects seemed to have abandoned this place. The silence was oppressive, wrapping around me like a shroud. About a mile from camp, I found the first sign that I wasn't the first visitor. Hidden among the rocks was an old fire ring, stones arranged in a perfect circle, ash long since scattered by wind and rain. Beside it, scratched into a flat stone, was a crude symbol, a vertical line bisected by 3 horizontal marks. I'd seen enough petroglyphs to know this wasn't ancient. The cuts were relatively fresh, maybe a few years old at most. Someone had been here, camped here, and left their mark. Further along, I found more. Scraps of fabric caught on thorns, a rusted can buried in sand, a perfectly stacked cairn of 7 stones that seemed to point deeper into the basin. But it was what I found behind a large boulder that made my stomach twist. A small clearing had been swept clean of debris, and in the center was a circle of objects, a woman's hair clip, a tarnished silver ring, a Swiss Army knife with the blade snapped off, and a torn photograph showing half a smiling face. They were arranged with purpose like offerings or trophies. I backed away, suddenly very aware of how exposed I was. The sun beat down mercilessly, but a cold sweat broke out across my back. Someone else had been here, recently, and they had left these things deliberately. I hurried back toward camp, keeping to the rocks, moving as silently as I could. Every shadow seemed deeper now, every boulder a potential hiding place. I found myself checking over my shoulder constantly, rifle held at the ready. What I had initially taken for isolation now felt like a trap. The basin wasn't empty. It was watching, waiting. By the time I reached my campsite, the sun was directly overhead, casting no shadows at all. I sat with my back against a large rock, rifle across my knees, and tried to think rationally. The most likely explanation was other campers. Hikers like me who had found this place and left their mark. The circle of objects could be some kind of trail tradition, like the bizarre shrines you sometimes find on long-distance paths. But if that were true, why did it feel so wrong? Why did the hair on the back of my neck stand up every time I thought about that torn photograph and its half-visible face? I decided to stay put for the rest of the day, to set up my shooting range not far from camp where I could keep an eye on my gear. I wasn't running scared, I told myself. I was being cautious, smart. I didn't realize then that it was already too late for caution. The basin had noticed me, and soon it would make sure I noticed it back. I set out around midday, heading back toward a dry wash I'd found during my earlier exploration. It was perfect for shooting. Natural walls to trap sound, plenty of space, good visibility in all directions. I brought a box of rounds, a couple of empty cans, and a battered old road sign I dragged out from a brush pile. As I set up my targets, I remember feeling not calm exactly, but distracted, focused. The smell of hot dust and gun oil grounded me in a way nothing else had since I'd arrived. The familiar weight of the rifle in my hands was reassuring, a connection to the normal world I'd left behind. I fired off maybe a dozen rounds, the crack of each shot echoing off the canyon walls in satisfying waves. For a moment, the silence of the basin was shattered, replaced by something I understood, something I controlled. Then I heard it. Not an echo, not a ricochet. Gunfire, coming from deeper in the basin. At first I paused, waiting to see if it repeated, half thinking I'd imagined it. But then it came again. Rapid bursts, different rhythms, definitely more than one weapon being fired. Some sounded sharp and high caliber, others duller and faster like handguns. This wasn't some other camper messing around, this sounded coordinated, like a live fire drill, or something much worse. I crouched low, adrenaline flooding my system. The shots were erratic, but they weren't moving away. If anything, they seemed to be fanning out, echoing off the canyon walls in weird patterns that made it impossible to tell how close they actually were. One moment they felt like they were miles off, the next like they were just over the next ridge. I packed up in record time and started back toward camp, staying low and keeping off open ground. Every now and then the gunfire would stop for a while, then start again, always just far enough to keep me guessing, but close enough that I felt like I was being tracked. Once I caught a whiff of something foul on the wind. It passed almost as quickly as it came, like old blood or rotting meat left in the sun. And I couldn't tell if it was real or just my nerves twisting my senses. By the time I reached camp, my shirt was soaked through with sweat, my hands shaking slightly as I slung my rifle over my shoulder. The shooting had stopped, but the air still felt tight, like something was holding its breath. I sat with my back against the rock wall, watching the perimeter of my little clearing as the sun started to sink behind the jagged skyline. My stomach twisted in knots, but I forced down a meal anyway. Beef stew from a pouch and a lukewarm bottle of water. It tasted like sawdust. As night rolled in, I did what I'd done the night before. I cleaned my rifle, restacked some of the firewood, anything to keep from sitting still too long. But the dread hadn't passed. If anything, it had thickened, like fog crawling in from the lowlands. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, to just grab my gear and hike out through the dark. But my logic kicked back just as hard. Hiking in pitch black, possibly being followed. That was asking for a twisted ankle, a fall, or worse. So I stayed. One more night, I told myself, just until sunrise. That was the worst mistake I've ever made. Around 2 a.m, I heard the first scream. It started as a sharp cry, distant but unmistakably human. A sudden burst of sound that cut through the stillness like a knife. I jolted upright, rifle already in my hand, scanning the trees and rocks around me. Then came a second scream, longer this time, hoarse, filled with panic. A woman's voice. "Someone help me, please." Closer now, and not just louder, but frantic. That voice. It didn't sound like an act. It was raw, broken, gasping between sobs. "He's gonna kill me. Please, I see your fire." I stepped out past the ring of firelight, flashlight flicking from tree to tree, rock to rock. My finger hovered near the trigger. I couldn't see anyone. No movement, no crunching leaves or snapping twigs, just the voice growing louder with each desperate cry. And then, as I stood frozen halfway between camp and the tree line, the voice repeated itself, word for word, same tone, same volume, same pauses. "He's gonna kill me. Please, I see your fire." It looped again and again. I backed away slowly, chest tight, bile rising in my throat. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. Something was mimicking her, using her voice like a recording. I don't know how long I stood there, locked in place, but then the scream stopped. A few seconds later, there was a single gunshot. Short, controlled, distant, but not far enough. Then silence. No wind, no birds, no footsteps. Just the fire crackling and my own pulse pounding in my ears. I retreated to my tent, zipping myself in as if the thin nylon could provide any protection. I knew it wouldn't. Whatever was out there, it had guns. It had that voice. And it knew exactly where I was. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting cross-legged beside the remains of my fire, rifle across my lap, listening to the dark press in from all sides. I didn't move, didn't speak, barely breathed. And just before dawn, as the sky began to shift from black to gray, I heard it one last time. Faint. Off to the west. Please. Help me. Same cadence, same pattern, like a broken record buried in the trees. The voice never got closer again, but it never left either. It hung in the air, fading and returning like a ghost caught in a loop, trapped between worlds. When the first rays of sunlight finally broke over the eastern ridge, I made my decision. I was leaving. Now. Before whatever was out there decided to do more than just toy with me. I left as soon as the light was strong enough to see the trail. No coffee, no food, just a flask of warm water and my gear barely stuffed into my pack. I wasn't careful about noise. I didn't even try to stay quiet. Something inside me had snapped, and all I could think about was putting as much distance as possible between myself and that place. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I expected to see someone, or something, standing there in the fading shadows, watching me leave. I pictured figures moving just out of sight, pacing me through the rocks, waiting for me to make a mistake. The hike out should have taken most of the day. On the way in, I'd stopped often, checked my bearings, taken notes. This time, I didn't stop at all. I barely blinked. I moved fast, pushing myself harder than I probably should have. Legs burning, lungs tight. Heart pounding in my chest like it was trying to break free. And still, I felt hunted. I kept imagining I'd hear it again. That voice, fraying at the edges, chasing me like an echo that didn't want to be forgotten. At one point, near a split in the trail, I spotted something that made my skin crawl. A footprint. Just one. Fresh. Pressed into the fine gray dirt like it had been made minutes ago. It was booted, but smaller than mine. Narrow. Possibly female. I didn't stop to investigate. I just ran. The terrain grew steeper as I climbed out of the basin. Loose rocks skittered under my boots, threatening to send me tumbling back down. Thorny brush clawed at my pants. The sun rose higher, beating down without mercy. I was halfway up a steep incline when I heard them again. Gunshots. Distant but distinct. 3 quick cracks followed by a longer burst. They were moving, hunting. I scrambled over the ridge and down into a dry creek bed, using the banks for cover. My lungs burned, sweat soaked through my shirt, my vision blurring at the edges. But I didn't slow down. When I finally spotted my truck, still parked under the rock overhang where I'd left it, a sob of relief caught in my throat. It looked impossibly normal. A reminder that a world existed beyond this nightmare. I tossed my gear into the bed without ceremony, jumped into the driver's seat and peeled out, sending up clouds of dust in my rear view. I didn't look back. Not once. I didn't want to see if someone, or something, was standing at the tree line, watching me disappear. It wasn't until I hit the first gas station an hour out that I realized I'd been gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were bloodless. I parked, stumbled inside, bought a sandwich I didn't eat, and a bottle of water I barely touched. A teenager behind the counter asked if I was okay, said I looked messed up. I nodded, smiled, told him I'd just gotten back from a long hike. I didn't tell him what I'd heard, what I'd felt, and I wouldn't tell anyone else for a long, long time. For weeks, the screaming echoed in my ears at night. I'd wake up covered in sweat, convinced I could still hear her calling for help just outside my bedroom window. My hands would reach instinctively for the rifle that wasn't there, heart hammering like it had all started over again. The worst part wasn't the fear, though. It was the shame. That woman had begged me. Begged. And I'd done nothing. I'd stood there, frozen, while someone in desperate need called out for help. I told myself 100 times over that I couldn't have known, that it could have been a trap, that maybe the voice wasn't even real. I convinced myself that rushing into the dark would have gotten me killed. That logic had saved me. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that campfire flickering and heard her voice and felt my body frozen in place, paralyzed by fear and indecision. I wanted to report it. I really did. I pulled up the sheriff's department contact page more times than I could count. But what would I say? That I heard a scream somewhere out in the wilderness? That I thought a woman might have been killed near Coldwater Basin, but I had no proof? No location? No names? They'd laugh me off. Or worse, think I was insane. So I didn't tell them, and that guilt stayed with me, settling in my chest like a second set of lungs that never fully let me breathe. Months passed. I buried it as best I could, pushed the memory down deep and piled distractions on top of it. Work, friends, projects. But late at night, it always clawed its way back up. Then one evening, a story popped up on one of the hiking forums I'd been part of for years. Just a simple thread. Anybody hear what happened near Coldwater Basin last spring? My stomach turned before I even clicked it. It was a short post. Someone had been hiking near the area weeks after I'd been there and stumbled across a collapsed campsite. Tent shredded, gear still scattered. The post mentioned blood, not a lot, but enough to make someone concerned. The user had reported it, and eventually law enforcement got involved. I read every word 3 times before clicking through the links. And that's how I found her name. Joanna Rivera. 29. Solo hiker. Last seen May 12th. She'd been reported missing by her sister when she failed to check in after her trip. The search had started late and was called off quickly due to a lack of leads. But by some impossible stroke of luck, a rancher found her nearly a week later, barely alive. She had been crawling through the brush near the southern ridge, miles from the nearest road. She was dehydrated, in shock, and had a gunshot wound just below her shoulder. One lung had collapsed. She spent 2 weeks in the hospital. The full story came out later, buried in the local papers and fringe blogs that still covered this kind of thing. Joanna had been abducted by a group of squatters living in a concealed dugout near the basin. 4 of them, 3 men, 1 woman, armed, paranoid, and strung out on meth. They'd been using the canyon as a hideout and occasionally luring in isolated hikers. Joanna had wandered too close. They grabbed her on her second night and kept her tied up, beaten, half-starved. She managed to escape when one of them passed out drunk, ran through the dark, screaming for help. They'd shot at her as she fled. 1 round hit her. The others missed. I remember reading that sentence over and over. She screamed for help as she fled into the trees, and thinking how close I had been, how real it all was, how she'd nearly died while I was crouched by a fire, rifle in hand, doing absolutely nothing. The squatters were arrested within the month. They found the dugout buried in a thicket of juniper and debris. Inside were weapons, supplies, blood-stained rope, and traces of other people. People they hadn't identified yet. 2 of the men had prior warrants in other states. 1 had killed before. Joanna survived. She recovered, gave her statement, and vanished from the news cycle not long after. I never reached out. I never came forward. What would I have said? That I was there? That I heard her? That I didn't help? That I could have done something and didn't? No. That was her story to survive. Mine was something else, something darker, something I'll carry to the end. I'm not writing this for sympathy or forgiveness. I'm not interested in some stranger patting me on the back and saying, "You did what you had to do." I know what I did, or rather, what I didn't do. I'm writing this because there's a dangerous lie people like to tell themselves, that it's better not to get involved, that it's safer to stay silent, that someone else will take care of it. But I've been that someone else. I've been the only person within shouting distance of someone who needed help desperately. And I froze. I stayed alive. But I didn't live after. Not really. If you ever find yourself out there and you hear something, someone crying for help, just know there's a cost either way. If you go, you might not come back. But if you don't, if you walk away, you might still lose something. And some things don't grow back. Sometimes I think about praying to God for forgiveness. But I know better. Some things you have to carry. Some debts can't be paid with words whispered into empty rooms. Some nights, I still hear her voice. Not in dreams, but in that space between waking and sleeping, when the mind is most vulnerable. And I wonder if she hears mine too. The silence that answered her when she needed someone most. That basin took something from both of us. From her, it nearly took everything. For me, it took whatever made me human enough to help another person in need. And I'm not sure which of us lost more. Ever since I was a little girl, geology has always been my one true passion. It started when I was 7 years old, when my dad took me and my brother on a family camping trip to Mammoth Cave National Park in my home state of Kentucky. We didn't go specifically to see the caves, but since it's a huge attraction in the park, enough so that it's named after it, we decided to go along to see what all the fuss was about. And it was a visit that would have a lasting impact on the rest of my life. At first, even though we were on a guided tour accompanied by a park ranger, I was genuinely frightened. We were walking down into this dark, dingy space unfit for human habitation, and to 7-year-old me, it could have been home to any number of terrifying subterranean monsters. Once I realized that we were just as safe below the earth as we were on the surface, the fear mellowed into a tingling excitement that had a profound effect on me. It felt like we were treading into some hallowed, forbidden space, with the stalactites and stalagmites giving the place an otherworldly alien feel. And from that day forward, I was hooked. I was that kid in high school who waxed lyrical about their collection of geodes, and every single accessory I owned was bejeweled with either rose quartz, azurite, amethyst, or pyrite. God forbid you complimented me on any of them, because you'd always get an earful of what kind of stone it was, where it came from, or how it was formed. Naturally, I had my heart set on getting a degree in geology before I'd even entered into high school, and after a few blissful years of immersing myself in my favorite subject, I decided I didn't want to leave. That's how I ended up becoming a research fellow at the University of New Mexico's Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences, with my specialty being field research. However, it was through my field research that I ended up going on the second caving trip that ended up changing my life. And unlike my first, which undoubtedly changed my life for the better, the second ended up changing it for the worse. In 2014, I was presented with the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance at conducting research in the Lechuguilla cave system near Carlsbad, New Mexico. To understand why this was such an amazing opportunity for me, I have to give you a little bit of backstory regarding the cave's history, and since I feel like I've already given you my life story, I'll try to keep it as short and sweet as possible. Up until the mid-80s, geologists believed that Lechuguilla was just a small, insignificant cave full of nothing but dry, dead-end passages. But in 1984, a group of cavers discovered that not only was Lechuguilla actually the 8th longest cave system in the world, but it was the deepest in the entire United States. So far, geologists have mapped over 150 miles of caves and tunnels that extend almost half a mile beneath the earth, and it's still not completely explored. Access is limited to approved scientific researchers, survey, and exploration teams, and it can sometimes take literally years for the Bureau of Land Management to grant permission to conduct a research assignment. Knowing how restricted access to Lechuguilla was, I'm sure you can imagine my excitement when I heard that not only was it our department that had been granted permission, but I was one of the researchers chosen to conduct fieldwork. Even so, all was not set in stone, and I had to jump through several hoops to guarantee my place on the team. As some of you might know, caving can be extremely dangerous, even to experienced field researchers such as myself. With that in mind, each potential member of the field team was subjected to a rigorous medical examination to ensure they were fit enough to be chosen. Obviously, this was for both insurance and security purposes, as no one with any underlying medical conditions could be allowed to potentially jeopardize such an important field trip. The psychological evaluation was equally intense. 3 separate sessions with the university psychologist, a battery of standardized tests, and a final evaluation by the department head. I can still remember the tension I felt waiting for the results. The email arrived at 3:42 a.m. on a Tuesday. I wasn't sleeping anyway. The anticipation had me checking my inbox every 20 minutes. When I saw the words, Lechuguilla Research Team, confirmed participants, my hands trembled so badly I nearly dropped my phone. My name was there, 4th on the list. I remember pressing my hand against my mouth to keep from screaming with joy and waking my roommate. I'd made it. I was going to Lechuguilla. The selection process had whittled our original pool of 12 candidates down to just 4. Not only were we some of the brightest and best in our field, we were also some of the fittest and most mentally sound researchers in the entire United States. We felt like the elite forces of geology or something, like we were the best of the best. But being the fittest and most competent couldn't stop what would happen to us down there in Lechuguilla. The events of that field trip have haunted me for almost 9 long years now. Over the next 6 weeks, I prepared obsessively. I doubled my regular workouts, focusing on core strength and flexibility. I studied every available map of the cave system, memorizing the known passages, junctions, and chambers. I practiced with the specialized equipment we'd be using, getting comfortable with the weight and feel of it. I even started sleeping on the floor occasionally, conditioning my body for the hard surfaces we'd encounter below. The field team consisted of myself, a fellow UNM researcher and longtime mentor named Joaquin, and 2 other field researchers, one from Louisiana State University and another from the University of Texas at Austin, both of whom shall remain nameless for reasons that will become obvious. We met twice before our eventual drive over to White City, and each time I remember walking away thinking very highly of the 2 researchers from Texas and Louisiana. Both guys were true field geologists, had both passed the medical exams, and both seemed like they could handle the outdoors enough to camp in the desert for a week. The LSU researcher particularly impressed me. He was in his early 40s with 15 years of caving experience in some of the most challenging systems in North America. He had an easy confidence about him, the kind that comes from genuine expertise rather than bravado. When he spoke about cave formations or geological processes, everyone listened. He had a particular interest in the unusual sulfuric acid dissolution that had formed Lechuguilla, a process dramatically different from how most caves develop. The UT Austin researcher was younger, maybe 30, with boundless enthusiasm and a brilliant analytical mind. He specialized in microbiology and was eager to study the unique bacteria that thrive in Lechuguilla's isolated environment. Some of these microorganisms had been sealed away from the surface for millions of years, evolving in complete isolation, and he believed they might hold medical significance, perhaps even novel antibiotics. Joaquin, my mentor, was approaching retirement, but remained as physically capable as researchers half his age. He had a weathered face that crinkled around the eyes when he laughed, which was often. Despite his cheerful demeanor, he was meticulous in his preparations, checking and double-checking our equipment with the careful attention of someone who knows exactly how dangerous our undertaking would be. By the time it came for us all to meet up in White City, I felt very confident that the field trip was going to go off without a hitch. The plan was to hike from White City to the entrance of the Lechuguilla cave system, set up camp just outside of it, then use the camp as our field HQ while spending several days working our way in and out of the cave, gradually getting deeper as the days went on. The morning of our departure arrived with a spectacular New Mexico sunrise, the sky ablaze with orange and pink as we loaded the final supplies into our vehicles. The drive to the trailhead was filled with animated discussion about the research ahead, and by the time we began our hike, my excitement was nearly overwhelming. The entrance to Lechuguilla is unassuming. A small, unremarkable opening in the limestone that gives no hint of the vast network beneath. We set up our base camp efficiently, each of us falling into our assigned roles. Joaquin supervised the establishment of our communications equipment, ensuring we could maintain contact with the surface team who would be monitoring our expedition. For the first few days, it was one of the most incredible field trips I've ever been on. The research was electric, the subject matter titanic, and the people I was with were all the very best at what they did. I think I soaked up more knowledge and experience from them in a few days than I had over the past 18 months. It was nothing short of heaven. On our first day below, we explored only the upper levels, areas that had been well mapped and studied. Even so, the beauty was breathtaking. Delicate, crystalline formations hung from the ceilings and rose from the floors in impossible shapes. The light from our headlamps caught the mineral deposits, sending rainbows dancing across the walls. The cave seemed to breathe around us, the subtle air currents causing minute changes in temperature that you could feel on your skin if you stood still enough. We collected samples methodically, photographing and documenting everything according to protocol. The UT Austin researcher was particularly animated, discovering several colonies of bacteria that he hadn't expected to find at this level. His enthusiasm was contagious, and even Joaquin, who had seen more caves than the rest of us combined, seemed reinvigorated by his excitement. Each night we emerged from the cave, exhausted but fulfilled, sharing our findings around the campfire, planning the next day's expedition, and sometimes simply sitting in companionable silence beneath the vast desert sky. The contrast between the enclosed world below and the infinite expanse above was striking, a reminder of the different scales at which our planet operates. As we ventured deeper on the second and third days, the cave revealed more of its secrets. We descended through narrow passages that opened suddenly into vast chambers, some large enough to house a cathedral. The formations became more exotic, curtains of flowstone that rippled like frozen waterfalls, delicate helictites that defied gravity, growing horizontally or even upward in curious spirals. The silence down there was absolute. When we turned off our lights and stopped moving, the darkness and quiet were so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat. In those moments, I understood why early humans regarded caves with such reverence and fear. There is something primal about being so deep within the earth, cut off from the sun, dependent entirely on your own resources and preparation. But despite the inherent unease of our surroundings, those first 3 days were marked by discovery and camaraderie. We worked well together, each contributing their expertise, supporting one another through the physically demanding traverses. The LSU researcher in particular seemed in his element, moving through the most challenging passages with ease, pointing out geological features the rest of us might have missed. None of us could have predicted how drastically everything would change on the fourth day. The fourth day began like the others. We ate breakfast together, reviewed our research objectives, and checked our equipment before entering the cave. Our plan was to push deeper than we had before, into an area that had been mapped but not extensively studied. The LSU researcher was especially eager, mentioning a particular chamber he wanted to examine that was known for its unusual mineral formations. The descent took nearly 3 hours. We moved carefully through a series of tight squeezes, rappelled down a 40-foot vertical shaft, and traversed a narrow ledge above a seemingly bottomless pit. The effort was worth it when we arrived at our destination, a massive chamber with walls that glittered with enormous gypsum crystals, some nearly transparent and longer than my arm. We worked methodically throughout the day, each focusing on our specific research areas. I was documenting a series of unusual erosion patterns that suggested periodic flooding in the distant past, while Joaquin collected mineral samples for later analysis. The UT Austin researcher carefully swabbed various surfaces, preserving bacterial samples in sealed containers. The LSU researcher moved somewhat apart from us, examining a series of small side passages that branched off from the main chamber. I noticed him spending a long time at one particular opening, shining his light into it from different angles, occasionally making notes but mostly just staring. When Joaquin called out that we should begin our return journey, he seemed reluctant to leave. As we made our ascent, he was unusually quiet. While the rest of us discussed our findings excitedly, he responded only in monosyllables, his mind clearly elsewhere. Back at camp, he barely touched his dinner and excused himself early, saying he needed to review his notes. I should explain that on that evening, after we had all retired to our tents, our colleague from LSU, went back into the caves. We were all absolutely exhausted from the day's caving, but for some reason, he wanted to head back into Lechugila to explore a little deeper into the tunnel that we hadn't fully investigated yet. Generally speaking, solo caving is extremely frowned upon. It's seen as irresponsible and overly dangerous, as if you get stuck or trapped somewhere. There's no one to help you or report that you're missing. But since this guy was easily one of the most experienced cavers any of us had ever worked with, we figured he'd have the sense not to get himself into any dangerous situations. So off he went, down into the caves to do a little extra research. He'd said that it'd be 2 hours at the most and that he'd be back well before sundown. But those 2 hours came and went without any word from him. Like I said, he was very experienced, but after 2 hours became 3 and almost 4, we started getting pretty worried about him. The temperature had dropped significantly, and a wind had picked up, sending swirls of dust through our campsite. Joaquin tried to raise him on the radio several times, but there was no response, not unusual given the depth and composition of the cave, which often blocked signals. We debated whether to go after him, with Joaquin arguing that he was experienced enough to handle himself, while the UT researcher and I felt we should at least check the entrance. Finally, we compromised. We would give him 1 more hour, and if he hadn't returned by then, we'd alert the surface support team and prepare a search. We spent that hour in tense silence, each of us imagining worst-case scenarios: a fall, a cave-in, equipment failure. And right before we were gearing up to head down into the cave after him, he suddenly reappeared, looking extremely pale. We asked if everything was okay, expecting to hear some story about a close call in a tunnel, something of that nature. But to our surprise, he told us that he was fine, and that he'd found something after exploring one of the caves that was very pertinent to our research. When we asked him what it was, and if he'd taken any pictures or video, he shook his head, saying if he had known he was going to run into it, he'd have brought a camera. We asked him again what it was that he'd seen, and after struggling to find the words, all he'd tell us was, "You guys gotta see this to believe it." His appearance was deeply unsettling. Though he insisted he was uninjured, he looked physically ill. His skin had a grayish tinge, and a fine sheen of sweat covered his face despite the cool night air. His eyes were the most disturbing, wide and unfocused, darting around as if tracking the movement of something the rest of us couldn't see. For the final few hours that we were awake, we pressed him on exactly what it was, and the more he refused to put it into words, the more I found a deep suspicion growing inside of me. From my perspective, the idea that an experienced geologist and caver was simply incapable of describing what he saw was nothing short of impossible, and at the time there was only one explanation for his behavior. I thought he wanted to guard what he'd seen so he could gain personal prestige from the find, but there was also something very unsettling about his behavior, and that was how frightened he seemed to be as a result of his discovery. It was like he didn't want to show us because he was afraid of what might happen, but at the time, I simply dismissed this as a kind of selfish, greedy glory-seeking. But how wrong I was. That night, I struggled to fall asleep. The wind had intensified, making the tent walls flutter and snap. But it wasn't just the noise keeping me awake. It was the memory of our colleague's face, the haunted look in his eyes. I kept replaying his words in my mind, trying to imagine what could possibly have affected him so strongly. Eventually, I drifted into a fitful doze, only to be jolted awake by sounds of a struggle. At first, it just sounded like they were engaged in a heated but hushed argument of some kind in the tent that the LSU and the UT Austin researchers were sharing. The canvas walls muffled their words, but the intensity was clear, sharp whispers rising occasionally into strained, urgent tones. I lay still, telling myself it was none of my business, just a disagreement between colleagues. Then I heard a yelp of what sounded like pain, followed by a series of thumping sounds, a body hitting the ground, thrashing. I grabbed my flashlight and scrambled out of my sleeping bag. I quickly woke Joaquin from his sleep and told him what I was hearing, and when he heard some horrific sort of wheezing sound, he ran out of our tent and over to the other. When he pulled open the flap, the beam of his headlamp illuminated a scene that branded itself permanently into my memory. The LSU researcher was straddling the chest of the UT Austin researcher, his hands clamped around his throat. The younger man's face was purple, his eyes bulging, feet drumming against the ground in desperate, weakening kicks. What struck me most wasn't just the violence of the act, but the expression on the LSU researcher's face. It wasn't rage or hatred, it was terror. Pure, unadulterated terror, as if he wasn't trying to kill his colleague, but rather some horrific thing that only he could see. He knows. He knows. He kept repeating in a voice that sounded nothing like his own. Higher, strained, almost childlike in its panic. I can't let him tell. I can't let any of you know what's down there. It took all our strength to separate them, but by then it was far too late. Joaquin tackled him from the side while I tried to pry his fingers from the younger man's throat. His strength was unnatural, fueled by whatever madness had seized him. The UT researcher had gone limp, his lips blue, a trickle of blood running from his nose. When we finally managed to break his grip, Joaquin immediately began CPR on the unconscious researcher while I tried to restrain his attacker. But the man was beyond reason, thrashing and scratching, his eyes wild and unfocused. He kept muttering, sometimes in coherent sentences, sometimes in fragmented phrases that made no sense. The walls, moving, breathing. They've been down there all along, watching us, studying us. They know we know. The UT Austin researcher has since suffered irreparable brain damage as a result of oxygen starvation. It's more likely that he'll never walk or eat unassisted for the remainder of his life. The LSU researcher was impossible to restrain, even once we pulled him off the other researcher. We tried everything we could to hold him down. But in the end, Joaquin was left with a split lip, and my nose was completely shattered after the deranged man slammed his forehead into my face. The pain was excruciating, a white-hot explosion across my face that momentarily blinded me. I fell back, hands clutching my shattered nose, warm blood pouring between my fingers. Through watering eyes, I saw him break from Joaquin's grip with a violent twist, knocking my mentor to the ground, and then he was running, not toward the trail that would lead back to civilization, but toward the cave entrance. Without a helmet, without a light, without supplies. He plunged into the darkness as if something was pulling him in, the night swallowing him whole. After he broke from our grip, we're almost certain that he ran back into the cave without any food, water, or protective clothing. And that is the last time we ever saw him. We were in no rush to pursue him after all, didn't think that he could just up and disappear in there. Even if all the tunnels are unexplored, there's still a limited amount of space where a person might try to hide themselves. Our focus was getting the UT Austin researcher the medical attention he needed. But even so, we just couldn't get him to a hospital in time to prevent permanent damage. The hours that followed blur together in my memory, a montage of desperate measures and crushing realizations. Joaquin continued CPR until the UT researcher began breathing again, but it was shallow and irregular. We used our satellite phone to call for emergency evacuation, but we were hours from the nearest hospital. I remember cradling the young researcher's head in my lap during the long wait for help, watching his chest rise and fall in uneven patterns, noticing how the vibrant intelligence had already vanished from his half-open eyes. Joaquin sat nearby, radio in hand, maintaining contact with the rescue team, his face carved with lines of grief and shock. When the helicopter finally arrived, its rotors whipping the desert sand into stinging clouds, I felt no relief, only a hollow emptiness. As the paramedics loaded our colleague onto a stretcher, one of them asked what had happened. Neither of us knew what to say. How could we explain what we didn't understand ourselves? Dawn was breaking by the time they departed, the sky lightening to a pale blue that seemed obscenely beautiful given what had transpired. Joaquin and I stood in silence, watching until the helicopter was nothing but a dark speck against the horizon. "We have to report this," he said finally, his voice roughened by exhaustion. "And we have to find him." A search and rescue team arrived by mid-morning. 6 professionals with cave rescue training and all the necessary equipment. They listened grimly as we recounted what had happened, their expressions growing increasingly concerned as we described our colleague's behavior. "Could it have been drugs?" one of them asked. "Or maybe a reaction to some fungus or bacteria in the cave." "He wasn't that kind of person," I said, though doubt had begun to creep in. How well did I really know him? And we were all exposed to the same environment, They organized a systematic search of the upper levels of the cave, but even with their expertise and equipment, the task was daunting. Lechugila's vast network of passages, chambers, and vertical drops made it like searching for a needle in a haystack, especially if the needle was actively trying to avoid detection. Meanwhile, Joaquin and I were questioned separately by police officers who had driven out from Carlsbad. They were clearly skeptical of our account, probing for inconsistencies, asking repeatedly about the relationship between the two researchers, whether there had been any previous conflicts. "People don't just snap without a reason," one officer told me, his pen poised above his notepad, especially not highly educated professionals with no history of violence. I couldn't argue with his logic, but I also couldn't provide the explanation he wanted. All I could do was repeat what we had seen, what little our colleague had said about his discovery, and how drastically his demeanor had changed afterward. The search continued for 3 days. Teams ventured deeper into the cave system than we had gone, exploring side passages and remote chambers. They found no trace of the LSU researcher, no equipment, no clothing, no signs of injury or struggle. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed him. On the 4th day, the search was scaled back. Resources were limited, and the chances of finding someone alive after so long in the cave without supplies were vanishingly small. By the end of the week, only a token effort remained: a missing persons report, a promise to check periodically, a folder that would gradually migrate to the back of some filing cabinet. As for the LSU researcher, his body was never recovered. At least I'm assuming they were looking for a body, as there's no way that a person could survive down there for long, not without ample supplies of food and water, neither of which he took with him when he ran off into the night. The academic aftermath was as painful as the physical one. Our research expedition was officially terminated, all our preliminary findings sealed pending investigation. The University of New Mexico distanced itself from the incident, releasing a statement expressing regret, but emphasizing that all proper protocols had been followed. Joaquin retired the following semester, his passion for fieldwork extinguished. We spoke occasionally in the months after, but our conversations were strained, haunted by what remained unsaid. Eventually, the calls stopped altogether. I took a leave of absence that stretched into a year, then 2. When I finally returned to academia, it was to a desk job analyzing samples collected by others, my days of fieldwork behind me. The nightmares had subsided somewhat by then, but they never disappeared entirely. In them, I'm always back in that tent, hearing those first sounds of struggle, knowing what's about to happen but unable to move, unable to prevent it. To this day, we don't know what he saw down there, or what happened in the run-up to him strangling our colleague from UT Austin. The cops interviewed the victim when he woke up from the coma, using some of the most advanced communication devices available, but none of what he communicated made any sense. When asked about what happened, his eyes would widen in terror, and the monitors tracking his vital signs would spike alarmingly. After several attempts that resulted in severe anxiety attacks, the questioning was discontinued. I visited him once, about a year after the incident. He was in a long-term care facility in Austin, his parents having relocated to be near him. The brilliant, enthusiastic researcher I had known was gone, replaced by a thin, vacant-eyed man who spent his days staring at the wall of his room. The doctors said he showed some recognition of family members, occasionally squeezed a hand in response to questions, but couldn't communicate beyond that. His mother was kind, showing me photos of him as he'd been before, graduating with honors, accepting research awards, smiling broadly on various hiking trips. "We still hope," she said, but the words sounded hollow, a mantra repeated so often it had lost its meaning. The most disturbing moment came as I was leaving. I had reached the door when I heard a sound behind me, a choked, guttural noise. I turned to see him looking directly at me, truly seeing me for the first time since I'd arrived. His right hand was raised, index finger extended, pointing not at me but past me, at the empty hallway. His face was contorted in an expression of such profound horror that I felt my own heart race in response. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the awareness vanished from his eyes. His hand dropped, and he returned to his vacant staring. His mother rushed to his side, calling for a nurse, while I stood frozen in the doorway, a cold weight settling in my stomach. What had he seen? What was he trying to warn me about? Or was it simply a random firing of damaged neural pathways, meaningless and coincidental? In the years since, I've researched similar incidents, looking for patterns, explanations. I've read about cave gases that can cause hallucinations, rare fungal infections that affect the brain, the psychological effects of prolonged darkness and sensory deprivation. None of it fully explains what happened to us. Occasionally, I hear rumors from the caving community, expeditions into deep systems that ended abruptly, researchers who returned changed in ways they couldn't or wouldn't articulate, sections of caves that remain unexplored despite their scientific interest. When I reach out to those involved, my messages go unanswered, or I receive terse replies that reveal nothing. Once, at a geology conference in Denver, I encountered a researcher who had been part of a recent expedition to Lechuguilla. When I mentioned my experience there, a strange expression crossed his face, not surprise or curiosity, but a careful blankness, a deliberate neutrality. Certain areas of the cave system have been permanently closed to research, he said, his voice carefully modulated, by order of the Bureau of Land Management, for conservation purposes. When I pressed him for details, which areas, why those specifically, he excused himself and avoided me for the remainder of the conference. What happened that night has haunted me for years, mainly because it remains an almost complete mystery. There's only one thing I'm certain of, though, and that's whatever caused the violent outburst. It was triggered by something the LSU researcher had seen down in the Lechuguilla cave system. And whatever it was, despite all my collegiate curiosity, I sincerely hope it stays buried forever. The first sign should have been the silence. Most people think forests are quiet, but they're actually full of sound. Birds calling, insects buzzing, leaves rustling. This forest was different. As I set up my tent at the edge of the Navajo Nation borderlands in northern Arizona, I noticed how the usual symphony of wilderness had dimmed to near nothing. Just the weather, I told myself, securing the last tent stake into the hard-packed earth. The camping spot I'd chosen was deep within the Coconino National Forest, about 12 miles from the nearest marked trail. I'd picked this location specifically for its isolation, to decompress after months of grinding at my job, to practice my survival skills, and to photograph some of the most untouched wilderness in the Southwest. My backpack contained everything I needed for my 5-day solo adventure: lightweight tent, sleeping bag, portable stove, water filter, first aid supplies, camera equipment, and enough dehydrated meals to last the week. I'd prepared meticulously, studied maps, left my itinerary with friends, and carried a satellite phone for emergencies. I was experienced. This was my 14th solo trip in 3 years. The sun was beginning its descent behind the pine-covered ridges when I finished setting up camp and gathered wood for a small fire. As dusk settled, I noticed strange markings on some of the trees surrounding my campsite. They looked like claw marks, but unnaturally high up, 7 or 8 feet from the ground. Too high for a bear. Mountain lion, maybe? I snapped a few photos for reference. The local ranger had warned me about this area when I'd registered my backcountry permit. The locals don't go there, he'd said, avoiding eye contact. Some Navajo folks say the border between forests is porous, not just for animals. I'd laughed it off. Years of outdoor experience had taught me that local superstitions were often exaggerated warnings about real wildlife dangers. Night fell quickly. Stars appeared in breathtaking clarity, undimmed by light pollution. I extinguished my fire early, packed all food items into my bear canister, and retreated to my tent. The temperature dropped rapidly. Inside my sleeping bag, I reviewed tomorrow's planned hike on my topographic map, a challenging route to a hidden canyon that few hikers ever visited. I must have fallen asleep because I woke suddenly around 2 a.m. Something had changed in the ambient sounds. I strained to listen. Footsteps? No. Something else. A rhythmic sound, almost like breathing, but deeper. Closer to the ground. Moving. My headlamp revealed nothing through the tent walls. The sound stopped immediately when I switched it on. I unzipped the tent slowly and peered out. The moonlight cast long shadows across my campsite. Nothing moved. I scanned the tree line methodically, my breath forming clouds in the cold night air. That's when I noticed the bear canister. I'd secured it properly against a tree about 50 yards from my tent. Now it was in the center of the clearing, lid removed, contents untouched. A warning tingle crawled up my neck. Bears don't open canisters without damaging them or taking the food. They don't return them to the middle of campsites. Someone, or something, was sending a message. I retreated inside, zipping the tent with trembling fingers. My satellite phone showed no signal, which was impossible given its technology. I'd tested it hours earlier. Sleep became impossible as I listened to the increasing sounds outside, cracking twigs, rustling leaves, and occasionally, what sounded like low whispering in a language I couldn't identify. By dawn, exhaustion had overtaken fear, and I'd fallen into fragmented sleep. When I finally emerged from my tent, the morning seemed mockingly normal. Birds chirped, sunlight filtered through trees. But three things had changed. First, my hiking boots, left outside the tent vestibule, were placed neatly side by side. Reversed. Left where right should be, right where left should be. Second, a circle of stones surrounded my tent, each stone placed precisely equidistant from the next, a formation impossible to create accidentally. Third, and most disturbing, a trail of deer tracks led directly to my tent, then abruptly switched to what looked like human footprints, before returning to deer tracks again. Something was stalking me, and it wanted me to know. I considered packing up immediately, but rationality fought against primal fear. The nearest trailhead was a full day's hike away. Starting now would mean traveling through unfamiliar terrain in growing darkness by evening. Better to remain until morning, I reasoned, and depart at first light. I photographed everything, the stone circle, the footprints, the oddly placed boots, before dismantling the campsite to move to a new location about a mile away. As I hiked to the new spot, carrying all my gear, I couldn't shake the sensation of being observed. Every few minutes I'd stop, pretending to check my map while actually scanning the forest around me. Several times, I caught glimpses of movement just at the edge of my peripheral vision, always gone when I turned to look directly. My new campsite was on higher ground with better visibility, a small clearing on a ridge overlooking a valley of ponderosa pines. I set up quickly, focusing on defensive positioning. Throughout the afternoon, I meticulously gathered information about my surroundings, taking compass readings, noting landmarks, creating escape routes. The methodical work helped keep panic at bay. Around sunset, I heard the first scream. It started as something approximating a woman's voice, high and desperate, coming from the valley below. My immediate instinct was to help. Someone could be hurt. But something felt wrong about the sound. It was almost performative, too consistent in its pitch and duration. Real screams of distress have variation, desperation. This sounded like an imitation. I stayed put, heart pounding. The screams continued for 3 minutes exactly, then stopped abruptly mid-cry. 30 seconds later, they resumed from a completely different direction, this time sounding more like a child. It's a mountain lion, I told myself firmly. They can sound like human screams. But mountain lions don't change positions that quickly or precisely. They don't time their calls with such unnatural regularity. Night fell completely. I didn't light a fire, not wanting to broadcast my location. Instead, I sat in my tent with my knife within reach and my headlamp off, listening intently. For hours, nothing happened beyond the normal sounds of wilderness at night. I began wondering if stress and isolation were affecting my judgment. At precisely midnight, according to my watch, the screaming began again. This time it circled my position, changing tone and timbre, but maintaining the same unnatural quality. Human, but not quite. Calculated to unsettle. The locals had stories about this. The ranger hadn't elaborated, but during my research I'd found forum posts from hikers claiming to have encountered something in these woods called a skinwalker. According to Navajo legend, skinwalkers were witches who could transform into animals. Modern accounts describe them as creatures that mimicked human voices to lure victims, or took the form of animals behaving in distinctly unnatural ways. I'd dismissed these stories as campfire tales. Now, alone in the dark with those circling screams, my skepticism wavered. The screaming stopped abruptly. Then came scratching against my tent fabric. Light at first, then more insistent. I froze, not even breathing. The scratching continued, moving methodically around the tent's perimeter. When it reached the door, it stopped. Something pressed against the fabric, creating a bulge in the tent wall. Not the shape of a human hand or an animal paw, but something in between. "I know you're a person," I said loudly, trying to keep my voice steady. "This isn't funny. I'm armed and I've notified the rangers of my location." Both lies. My knife would do little against a determined attacker, and the rangers had only a vague idea of my whereabouts. No response came, but the pressure against the tent disappeared. For several minutes, complete silence fell. Then a voice spoke. So close to the tent it could have been inside. "Not person," it said in a raspy whisper that sounded like someone unused to forming words. "Not animal. I am between." My body went rigid with fear. The voice was clearly human, someone trying to terrify me by playing into local legends. But knowing this didn't diminish my terror. "Leave me alone," I managed to say. "Cannot," the voice replied. "You are in my territory now. I have marked you." The memory of the reversed boots, the stone circle, flashed in my mind. During my research, I'd read that skinwalkers supposedly marked their victims before hunting them. "What do you want?" I asked. No answer came. Instead, I heard retreating footsteps, bipedal at first, then shifting to what sounded like an animal's gait. The forest fell silent again. I didn't sleep. I sat awake all night with my back against a tree and my knife in hand, watching the surrounding woods. Twice more I heard circling footsteps. Once I saw a deer at the edge of the clearing, standing unnaturally still, staring directly at me with eyes that reflected my headlamp beam in an unnatural red glow. By dawn, I'd made my decision. I would leave immediately, regardless of the challenging day hike ahead. Whatever was happening, whether elaborate hoax, dangerous predator, or something my rational mind couldn't accept, I needed to get away from this place. As first light brightened the eastern sky, I packed quickly. That's when I discovered that during the night, someone had removed my compass from my pack and smashed it. The satellite phone still showed no signal. And a new discovery turned my blood to ice. My topographic map had been altered. Someone had drawn over it, marking paths that didn't exist on the original, with a crude symbol repeated at various locations. The symbol matched the strange marks I'd seen carved into trees around my original campsite. Logic became my lifeline. Whatever, or whoever, was terrorizing me clearly wanted me to panic, to run blindly through unfamiliar terrain. That's when accidents happen in the wilderness. That's when you become truly vulnerable. I forced myself to think methodically. Without my compass, I'd need to navigate by the sun. Without my map, I'd need to rely on landmarks I remembered. Most importantly, I needed to reach higher ground to possibly get satellite phone reception. The rising sun indicated east. The main trail that would lead back to civilization lay roughly northeast of my position. I shouldered my pack and began hiking uphill, away from the direction of the disturbing events of the night before. As I climbed, the forest grew thinner, offering better visibility. 2 hours into my hike, I reached a rocky outcropping that provided a vantage point across miles of wilderness. I tried the satellite phone again. Still nothing. Either it was damaged or something was actively blocking the signal, a thought I didn't want to dwell on. From my elevated position, I spotted a fire tower in the distance, maybe 5 miles away. An active tower would have radio communications and Forest Service personnel. It became my new destination. The day grew uncommonly hot for the season. My water supply, meant to last 5 days, would need careful rationing now that I was exerting myself more than planned. Every few hundred yards, I stopped to listen and observe. Several times I found those same strange markings carved freshly into trees along my path. Impossible to miss, as if my stalker wanted me to know they were still tracking me. Around midday, I discovered footprints on the trail ahead. Barefoot human prints that suddenly transformed mid-stride into what appeared to be deer tracks. The obvious staging of this display suggested psychological warfare rather than supernatural ability. Someone was going to extraordinary lengths to terrify me, using the Skinwalker legend as a template. But why? And who would know these remote woods well enough to track and anticipate my movements? By late afternoon, I'd covered about 3 miles toward the fire tower. Progress was slow due to my constant vigilance and the need to detour around areas where I felt particularly exposed. The sun would set in approximately 2 hours. I needed shelter before darkness fell. I found a defensible position beneath an overhanging rock face. Not ideal, but better than being completely exposed. As I set up a minimal camp, I discovered another disturbing development. Some of my food had been removed from my pack and replaced with small bundles of twigs bound with what looked like human hair. My remaining food would last 2 days at most. The water situation was becoming critical too. My filter had mysteriously disappeared, meaning I couldn't safely replenish from streams. As sunset approached, I heard it again. That unnatural screaming, now from multiple directions simultaneously. Impossible for a single person or animal to create such an effect. My stalker had accomplices or audio equipment. Either way, they were closing in. I made a desperate decision. Traveling at night was dangerous, but staying put might be worse. Using the last light of day, I gathered what I needed for overnight travel and left the heavier items behind. With my pack significantly lighter, I could move faster. As darkness fell completely, I began moving toward the fire tower, navigating by starlight. The screaming continued behind me, sometimes seeming to draw closer, sometimes fading. I maintained a steady pace, refusing to run and risk injury. 3 hours into my night journey, I heard something large moving parallel to my path, just out of sight in the trees. It matched my pace exactly. When I stopped, it stopped. When I moved, it moved. I caught glimpses of a tall, thin silhouette occasionally illuminated by moonlight, unnaturally tall, with movements that seemed disjointed. "I know you're human," I called out, summoning courage I didn't feel. "The Rangers are searching for me. They know where I am." A low laugh responded, the first genuinely human sound I'd heard from my stalker. Then words, spoken in that same raspy voice. "They never find people I take. 6 hikers gone in these woods. Rangers found nothing." My mind raced. There had been disappearances in these forests over the years. Hikers who ventured off trail and were never seen again. Authorities blamed exposure, accidents, disorientation. But what if something else, someone else, was responsible? "What do you want?" I demanded. "To hunt," came the simple reply. "To frighten. To watch you run." The voice came from directly behind me now. I spun around, headlamp illuminating the trail, and found myself face to face with my stalker. The figure stood about 7 feet tall, wearing an elaborate costume made from animal hides and bones. The face was obscured by what appeared to be a deer skull, modified with additional antlers and decorated with symbols matching those I'd seen carved into trees. Behind the eye sockets of the skull, human eyes watched me with predatory intensity. I ran. Pure survival instinct took over. I sprinted through the forest, abandoning the trail, ducking under branches, and leaping over obstacles. Behind me, I heard pursuit. Not the frantic crashing of someone running, but a measured, almost casual pace. My stalker knew these woods intimately, knew I had nowhere to go. After 10 minutes of desperate flight, a stitch in my side forced me to slow. I'd lost my headlamp during the run and had only moonlight to navigate by. Stopping to listen, I heard nothing. Had I lost my pursuer? Then came a sound that froze me in place, a low, rhythmic clicking noise unlike anything I'd ever heard. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. I pressed on, moving as quietly as possible, constantly changing direction. The forest blurred around me. Hours passed in a terrifying game of cat and mouse. Sometimes the clicking would fade, only to resurface closer than before. Twice more I caught glimpses of the costumed figure, always watching, always following, but never rushing to catch me. As dawn approached, a miraculous sight appeared through the trees. The fire tower, much closer than I'd estimated. In my panicked flight, I'd actually moved toward my destination rather than away from it. With renewed determination, I broke from the tree line and sprinted across the clearing toward the tower. The clicking sound intensified behind me, accompanied by an inhuman howl of rage. For the first time, my pursuer seemed genuinely alarmed that prey might escape. I reached the tower stairs and took them two at a time, my legs burning with exertion. At the top, I found the observation room locked. I pounded on the door, screaming for help. After what seemed like an eternity, the door opened to reveal a startled Forest Service ranger. "Jesus," he said, pulling me inside and locking the door behind me. "What happened to you?" I collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath. Through the window, I could see the edge of the forest where I'd emerged. A figure stood there, still wearing that grotesque deer skull headdress. As we watched, it retreated slowly into the trees. "That's him," I pointed. "The one who's been stalking me." The ranger grabbed binoculars. "I don't see anyone now," he said, scanning the tree line. Then, more soberly, "But you're not the first to come here with stories like this." In the safety of the tower, I learned the truth. Local authorities had documented at least 9 disappearances in these woods over the past decade. Several hikers who'd escaped reported encounters with what they described as a skinwalker. The reality, as the ranger explained, was possibly more disturbing. They believed a former wilderness guide had gone rogue years ago, living off the grid and developing an elaborate method of terrorizing hikers using the skinwalker legend as cover. The costume, the markings, the manipulated animal sounds, it's all designed to create maximum psychological terror, the ranger explained as we waited for emergency response to arrive. He knows these woods better than anyone, knows exactly how to make people panic and make fatal mistakes. "But why?" I asked. "Some people hunt for food, some hunt for sport." The ranger looked out at the vast, silent forest. "And some hunt just to experience the power of another person's fear." 3 days later, a search party found my abandoned campsite. My equipment had been arranged in a bizarre tableau, tent shredded and hung from trees, sleeping bags stuffed with forest debris and positioned to look like a human form. The strange symbols had been carved into every surrounding tree. Of my stalker, they found no trace. The forest had reclaimed him, at least for now. But sometimes at night, I still hear that rhythmic clicking sound in my dreams, and I know that somewhere in those remote woods, he continues to hunt, using humanity's oldest fears against us. Not because he's supernatural, but because he understands that believing in monsters makes us vulnerable in ways that simply facing another human never could. Our town of Pinecrest sat on the edge of what locals called the North Woods, not because it was particularly northern, but because it stretched along the north side of our rural community. Houses were scattered across several acres each, with thick patches of forest serving as natural privacy barriers between properties. Growing up here meant learning to navigate these wooded areas as shortcuts between friends' homes. I was 15 that autumn, a sophomore at Pinecrest High, while my sister Catherine, Kate to everyone who knew her, was 17 and already planning her escape to college. Our parents, Robert and Ann Winters, were typical suburban professionals. Dad worked as an engineer for the local manufacturing plant, and Mom taught history at my high school. We lived in a modest 2-story colonial at the end of a winding cul-de-sac on Spruce Lane. On weekends, Kate and I often visited our friend Ellie, who lived about a mile away. Her house sat on the other side of a particularly dense stretch of woods, but we knew the path well. During daylight hours, the walk was pleasant, with dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. After dark, however, the forest transformed into something altogether different. Our parents insisted on driving us if we stayed past sunset, a rule we rarely questioned. The woods were home to the occasional coyote, and the path could be treacherous in the dark. But teenagers, as they do, occasionally bend parental rules when circumstances allow. Friday, October 12th began like any other autumn day. The morning air carried a crisp chill, and leaves in vibrant shades of crimson and amber carpeted the ground. I remember watching the weather forecast before school, noting the newscaster's mention of the new moon that night. "Stargazers will be disappointed," she'd said, "as the sky will be particularly dark without lunar illumination." I hadn't given it much thought then. Why would I? It was just another Friday, with plans to watch movies at Ellie's after school. Mom had reminded us at breakfast that she and Dad would be attending a dinner party with colleagues that evening. "We'll be at the Brewsters until around 11, she'd said, pouring coffee into her travel mug. "Call if you need a ride home from Ellie's. Don't walk back in the dark." Kate and I had nodded, barely looking up from our phones. A typical morning exchange, forgettable in every way. That evening we walked to Ellie's house just before sunset, enjoying the last warm rays of October sun. The dinner at Ellie's was pizza and sodas, followed by a marathon of horror movies, the irony of which wouldn't escape me later. We lost track of time, engrossed in the fictional terror playing out on the screen, completely unaware of what awaited us outside. When Ellie's mother glanced at her watch and announced it was nearly 10 p.m., Kate and I exchanged looks of concern. We hadn't planned to stay so late. "Should we call Mom and Dad?" I asked. Kate checked her phone. "They're still at the Brewsters' party. I don't want to bother them. Besides, we've walked the path 100 times. "Not on a new moon night," Ellie pointed out. Kate shrugged. "We have our phone flashlights. It's only a mile." This casual decision, this small moment of teenage hubris, would alter everything that followed. We said goodbye to Ellie, declining her mother's offer to drive us. "It's not that late," Kate insisted. "We'll be fine." The temperature had dropped considerably since our arrival. Our light jackets provided minimal protection against the autumn chill as we started down Ellie's long driveway. Our breath formed small clouds that dissipated quickly in the darkness. The entrance to the forest path stood before us like a black curtain. Kate turned on her phone flashlight, and I followed suit. The beams cut thin corridors through the darkness but illuminated barely 10 feet ahead. The trees, stripped of leaves, created a lattice of skeletal branches above us, blocking what little starlight might have guided our way. "Stay close," Kate said, her voice already lower than normal. The forest floor was damp from an earlier drizzle, muffling our footsteps as we ventured deeper into the woods. Fallen leaves made the path slippery in places. The familiar route suddenly seemed alien in the profound darkness. We had traveled perhaps half the distance, reaching the densest part of the forest, when Kate stopped abruptly. I nearly collided with her back. "What's wrong?" I whispered. "Listen," she said, her voice barely audible. I held my breath, straining to hear whatever had caught her attention. For several seconds, there was only silence. Then I heard it. A raspy inhalation followed by a wheezing exhale. The sound came from somewhere behind us. "Probably just a raccoon or something," I suggested, though I didn't believe it. Kate didn't respond, but her posture had changed. Her shoulders tensed, and she gripped her phone tighter. We resumed walking, our pace noticeably quicker. The path narrowed, forcing us into single file. Kate led the way, while I took the rear position. With each step, my awareness of the breathing behind us intensified. It maintained a steady distance, not advancing, but never receding either. Then came the footsteps. Unlike the scurrying of forest animals or the four-beat rhythm of deer, these steps had a distinctly bipedal cadence. Step, drag, step, drag, as if one leg wasn't functioning properly. My heart hammered against my ribs. Kate must have heard it too because her pace increased again. "Don't run," I whispered. "Not yet." I turned, sweeping my flashlight in a wide arc behind us. For a fraction of a second, the beam caught something approximately 30 yards back. The figure stood upright, impossibly thin. What struck me most was its skeletal appearance. Not the thinness of malnutrition, but a wrongness in its proportions. Its head appeared elongated, with what looked like a canine-shaped snout and pointed ears. The skin or surface of the figure seemed hairless, with a texture I couldn't identify at that distance. Before I could focus, the figure stepped sideways into the darkness between trees, vanishing from the flashlight's beam. "Kate!" I hissed, grabbing her jacket. "There's something following us." She turned, aiming her light where mine had been. "I don't see anything." It moved. But it's there. I saw it. The breathing continued, now accompanied by a faint clicking sound, like nails or claws tapping against tree bark. "We need to run," Kate said, no longer bothering to keep her voice down. We broke into a sprint, abandoning all pretense of calm. The path ahead twisted through the trees, roots threatening to trip us with every step. Our house lay approximately a quarter-mile ahead, just beyond the forest's edge. Behind us, the breathing grew louder. The irregular footsteps accelerated into a consistent rhythm. Step, 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 step. Whatever pursued us was no longer dragging its leg. We burst from the tree line onto our street, gasping for air. The sudden transition from forest to suburb should have felt like safety, but the street was deserted. No cars passed by. No neighbors were visible in their yards or windows. Just empty pavement illuminated by widely spaced streetlights. Our house stood at the end of the cul-de-sac, porch light glowing like a beacon. We sprinted up the long driveway, our legs burning with exertion. Kate reached the front door first, yanking frantically at the handle. "It's locked!" she cried. "Your keys!" I reminded her between gasps. "You have your keys!" As she fumbled in her pocket, I turned to look behind us. For a moment, the street appeared empty. Then I spotted it. A figure crouched at the edge of our driveway, partially concealed by our neighbor's hedge. In the ambient light from nearby houses, its outline was clearer than before. The thinness I'd noticed was even more pronounced. Its limbs bent at unnatural angles, and its head remained disproportionately elongated. Most disturbing was the awareness that it was watching us. I could still hear its labored breathing from 30 yards away. "Kate," I whispered without turning. "It's right there." The jingling of keys seemed to last an eternity before she finally pushed the door open. We tumbled inside, slamming and locking the door behind us. For several minutes we stood in the foyer, catching our breath, afraid to move or speak. Finally, Kate approached the living room window, carefully pulling aside the curtain to peer outside. I joined her, searching for the crouched figure by the hedge. It was gone. Our parents returned from their dinner party an hour later, finding Kate and me still awake, huddled together on the living room couch with all the lights on. "You're both still up?" Mom asked, setting her purse on the entry table. "I thought you'd be at Ellie's." "We walked home," Kate said, her voice steadier than I expected. Dad frowned, hanging his coat in the closet. "In the dark? You know the rule about that." "We didn't want to bother you," I explained. Something in our expressions must have revealed our distress because Mom's demeanor shifted immediately. She sat beside us on the couch. "What happened?" We told them everything. The walk through the woods, the breathing sounds, the figure I'd glimpsed with my flashlight, and its appearance at the edge of our driveway. We described its skeletal thinness, its elongated head, the unnatural angles of its limbs. With each detail, Dad's expression grew more skeptical while Mom's became increasingly concerned. "You probably saw a deer," Dad suggested. "They can look strange when they stand on their hind legs to reach branches." "It wasn't a deer," Kate insisted. It followed us the entire way. Or maybe a large coyote, he continued. They've been spotted in the area. Coyotes don't walk on two legs, I said. Dad sighed, rubbing his temples. What exactly are you suggesting you saw? Neither of us had an answer. We couldn't name what had followed us because it matched nothing in our experience. Whatever it was, Mom interjected, you're both safe now. But no more walking after dark, understood? Not even if it means calling us away from a dinner party. Dad stood, moving toward the window. I'll take a look around outside, make sure there's nothing lurking about. Robert, don't, Mom protested. If some vagrant is prowling around our property, I want to know about it, he replied, already retrieving the baseball bat he kept near the back door. We watched through the window as Dad circled the house, flashlight in one hand and bat in the other. He checked the perimeter, investigating the hedges where I'd seen the figure crouching. Finding nothing, he returned inside, locking the door behind him. All clear, he announced. Nothing but raccoons in the Johnsons' trash cans. You girls probably saw an animal and your imagination did the rest. It happens in the dark. We didn't argue, but neither Kate nor I believed his explanation. What we'd seen wasn't a product of overactive imagination. The systematic way it had pursued us, the calculated manner in which it had hidden at the edge of our property. These weren't animal behaviors, at least, not from any animal native to our region. Sleep came reluctantly that night. I lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the house settling and the occasional rustling of branches against my window. Each noise made me tense with anticipation, wondering if the thing had returned. When exhaustion finally claimed me, my dreams were filled with emaciated figures running through endless forests. The following night brought a false sense of normalcy. We ate dinner as a family, watching a game show on television afterward. By midnight, everyone had retired to their respective bedrooms. I'd almost convinced myself that the previous night's events were exaggerated by fear and darkness. Almost, but not entirely. Around 12:30 a.m., I heard Dad's heavy footsteps in the hallway. Our house had a strict waste management system, primarily enforced by Mom, who couldn't tolerate the smell of garbage overnight. Dad's responsibility included taking out the trash before bed, regardless of the hour. I listened as he descended the stairs. The back door opened with its distinctive creak, followed by the sound of the screen door tapping against its frame. Normal sounds. Familiar sounds. Then came the scream, short, abrupt, more surprised than pained. A heavy thud followed, as if something had struck the side of the house with considerable force. "Let me in," Dad's voice called from the back porch. "Open the door." Fear paralyzed me momentarily before I threw off my covers and raced into the hallway. Kate emerged from her room simultaneously, eyes wide with alarm. We hurried downstairs together, reaching the kitchen just as Mom descended behind us. Dad practically fell through the doorway when we opened it. His face was ashen, contorted in a mixture of shock and pain. The right leg of his pajama pants was torn, revealing several puncture wounds on his ankle. Blood seeped from the injuries, staining the kitchen tile. "What happened?" Mom gasped, helping him to a chair. "Something bit me," he said between labored breaths. "It was hiding beside the trash cans. I didn't see it at first." Kate retrieved the first aid kit from beneath the sink while Mom examined the wound. The punctures formed a semicircle pattern consistent with a bite, but the configuration didn't match typical dog or coyote dentition. The spacing was too narrow, the individual wounds too deep. "What did it look like?" I asked, already certain of the answer. Dad's hands trembled slightly as Mom cleaned the punctures with antiseptic. I didn't get a good look at first. It was low to the ground, like it was crouching. When it bit me, I yelled and kicked at it. That's when it stood up. He paused, seemingly reluctant to continue. "It stood up?" Kate prompted. Dad nodded. "On two legs. The thing was at least a foot taller than me when it stood upright. Its arms were too long and its face..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "I didn't see it clearly. It all happened so fast." "We need to call the police," Mom insisted, reaching for her phone. "And tell them what?" Dad countered. that an unidentifiable creature bit me and disappeared into the night. They'll think I'm intoxicated or hallucinating. Then the hospital, Mom insisted. Those punctures are deep. You need antibiotics, possibly rabies prophylaxis. Dad didn't argue against medical attention. Within 20 minutes, Mom had helped him to the car, instructing Kate and me to lock all doors and windows and to call immediately if anything unusual occurred. They returned from the emergency room 4 hours later. Dad had received a tetanus booster, antibiotics, and the first in a series of rabies shots. The attending physician had documented the incident as a wild animal attack, species undetermined. I told them it was a stray dog, Dad explained as he settled onto the couch, his bandaged ankle elevated on a pillow. Anything else would have raised too many questions. Mom appeared exhausted, dark circles forming beneath her eyes. The doctor said the bite pattern was unusual, not typical of canines in this region. What else could it be? Kate asked. No one offered an answer. The following days brought changes to our household routine. Dad installed motion sensor lights around the property's perimeter. He purchased a more sophisticated security system with cameras monitoring all entry points. The new family rule became absolute. No one went outside after sunset under any circumstances. Dad's wounds healed without infection, though he walked with a slight limp for several weeks afterward. The physical recovery progressed well, but something fundamental had changed in him. The skeptic who had dismissed our encounter now jumped at unexpected noises. He checked and rechecked door locks before bed. He purchased a firearm, something he had previously opposed on principle, and kept it secured in a bedside safe. Mom researched local wildlife, consulting with forestry services about unusual animal sightings in the area. The reports mentioned nothing resembling what we had encountered. Kate and I no longer walked to Ellie's house, even during daylight hours. When friends asked why, we manufactured excuses about busy schedules and family obligations. How could we explain what had happened? Who would believe us? School continued. Homework was completed. Meals were prepared and consumed. From the outside, the Winters family appeared normal, if perhaps more security conscious than before. But within our home, conversation often faltered when the subject of that night arose. One evening, approximately 2 weeks after Dad's encounter, I noticed him staring through the living room window, his attention fixed on the forest edge beyond our property line. "Do you think it's still out there?" I asked, joining him at the window. He didn't look away from the darkening tree line. "I don't know, but something is." "What do you mean?" Dad hesitated before responding. "The motion lights have been triggering almost nightly, usually around 3 in the morning. The cameras don't catch anything, just shadows that could be branches moving in the wind." "Have you told Mom?" "No need to worry her more than necessary." He turned to face me directly. "But I need you to promise me something. If you ever see it again, inside or outside this house, you run. Don't try to confront it. Don't try to understand it. Just run." The seriousness in his expression frightened me more than his words. My father, the pragmatic engineer who believed every problem had a logical solution, was advising flight over understanding. "What is it, Dad? What do you think that thing is?" He shook his head slowly. "I've spent my life believing that nature operates according to established principles. That unexplained phenomena simply lack sufficient investigation." He paused, returning his gaze to the window. "I'm no longer certain of that." Winter arrived with early snowfall in November. The forest transformed, bare branches now carrying burdens of white. School canceled for 2 consecutive days due to treacherous road conditions. Our house felt like an island in a sea of unmarked snow. The isolation should have been comforting. Whatever had stalked us would surely leave tracks in the pristine whiteness surrounding our property. Yet the motion sensor lights continued to activate during early morning hours, sometimes triggering in sequence as if something were circling the house. On the 3rd night of snowfall, I woke to a scratching sound at my bedroom window. My room was on the 2nd floor, with no trees close enough for branches to reach the glass. The scratching continued, deliberate, rhythmic. 3 scrapes followed by a pause, then repeated. I remained motionless in bed, scarcely breathing as I stared at the curtained window. The digital clock on my nightstand displayed 3:17 a.m. Outside, one of the motion sensor lights activated, casting shadows across my ceiling. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a now familiar sound: raspy inhalation, wheezing exhalation. Something was breathing just outside my window, 20 feet above the ground. Moving as silently as possible, I reached for my phone on the nightstand. The scratching resumed, more insistent than before. I typed a text message to Kate, whose bedroom was across the hall. Something at my window. Don't turn on lights. Get Dad. The response came within seconds. On it. Minutes passed like hours as I lay paralyzed in bed, watching the window. The curtain moved slightly, as if disturbed by air currents from outside. But the window was closed. Something was manipulating the fabric from the other side of the glass. A corner of the curtain lifted, revealing a sliver of the night beyond. A long, thin appendage, neither clearly a finger nor a claw, had hooked the fabric's edge. The digit appeared jointed in too many places, its surface smooth and grayish in the dim light. The hallway outside my room suddenly flooded with light as Dad emerged from the master bedroom. The appendage withdrew instantly, releasing the curtain. Heavy footsteps approached my door, followed by Dad's voice calling my name. I didn't respond immediately, still watching the window. The breathing sound had ceased, but I couldn't shake the certainty that whatever had been there remained just out of sight. My bedroom door opened, revealing Dad with his newly purchased firearm in hand. Kate stood behind him, face pale with worry. "It was at the window," I whispered, pointing toward the curtain. "It was trying to look inside." Dad approached the window cautiously, using the barrel of the gun to separate the curtains. He peered outside, scanning the darkness before turning back to me. "There's nothing there now," he said, "but there are marks on the siding." He didn't elaborate on what kind of marks, and I didn't ask. We spent the remainder of the night in the living room, lights illuminating every corner. No one suggested returning to bed. No one mentioned calling authorities. We had crossed some threshold of understanding. This was our burden to bear alone because no one else would comprehend what we faced. When daylight finally arrived, Dad ventured outside to examine the exterior wall beneath my window. He returned with photographs on his phone. 4 parallel grooves cut into the vinyl siding, approximately 6 feet in length, leading up to my window. The marks didn't resemble claw scrapes or tool marks. They appeared almost deliberate, like a message inscribed in a language we couldn't decipher. That afternoon, Dad installed metal security grates over every window in the house. Mom didn't object to the expense or the prison-like appearance they created. None of us objected. We understood the necessity. Spring arrived, melting snow and revealing the dormant landscape beneath. 5 months had passed since our initial encounter. The scratching at my window hadn't repeated, though the motion sensors still occasionally activated without apparent cause. I had begun researching similar incidents, spending hours in the school library and online, searching for patterns that might explain what we had experienced. Kate, preparing for college in the fall, assisted when her schedule permitted. We compiled reports of unusual sightings, unexplained animal attacks, and aberrant wildlife behavior within a 100-mile radius of our town. Most accounts proved mundane upon closer examination: misidentified known animals, optical illusions created by lighting conditions, or outright fabrications. But a handful of reports contained details that resonated with our experience. A hiker in the national forest 30 miles north had photographed unusual tracks in mud, bipedal, but with an asymmetrical gait suggesting one leg differed from the other. A farmer reported livestock injuries with bite patterns inconsistent with recognized predators. 3 separate accounts described unusually tall, thin figures observed at forest edges during twilight hours. None provided definitive evidence, but collectively they suggested we weren't alone in our experience. Whatever had followed us home that night had encountered others before and since. I compiled my findings in a journal, documenting dates, locations, and commonalities between reports. A pattern emerged. Sightings clustered along waterways and concentrated in areas where suburban development encroached upon old-growth forest. Our neighborhood, built 20 years earlier in what had once been continuous woodland, fit the profile perfectly. During a weekend exploration of the woods between our house and Ellie's, conducted in daylight and with Dad's reluctant permission, Kate and I discovered something unexpected. In a small clearing approximately halfway along the path, we found a crude structure assembled from fallen branches and strips of bark. The construction resembled a shelter or blind, positioned to provide a view of the path while remaining concealed by surrounding vegetation. "Someone built this," Kate said, examining the interwoven branches. "Recently." The implications disturbed us both. Either a person had constructed this observation post, suggesting human involvement in what we had experienced, or the thing itself possessed intelligence and purpose beyond animal instinct. We photographed the structure before continuing our investigation. Deeper in the woods, approximately 50 yards from the main path, we discovered a small cave entrance partially concealed by boulders. The opening was narrow, perhaps 3 feet in height and 2 feet wide, but darkness prevented us from seeing how far the cavity extended. A peculiar odor emanated from the opening, not the expected earthiness of a natural cave, but something sharper, more acrid. It reminded me of a chemistry lab with undertones of decay. "We should come back with flashlights," Kate suggested. I disagreed emphatically. "We shouldn't come back at all." We marked the location on a map before returning home, sharing our discoveries with our parents. Dad's reaction surprised us both. Rather than dismissing our findings or cautioning against further exploration, he immediately contacted a friend who worked for the state environmental agency. 2 days later, Dad's friend arrived with equipment to inspect the cave. We watched from a distance as he donned protective gear before entering the narrow opening. He emerged 30 minutes later, his expression unreadable behind his respirator mask. The official report, delivered a week later, described the cave as unremarkable, a natural formation approximately 12 feet deep with no signs of animal habitation or human activity. Air samples revealed elevated levels of methane and sulfur compounds consistent with organic decomposition, explaining the unusual odor. Dad's friend pulled him aside before departing, a conversation we weren't meant to overhear but did anyway. "There's something else," he said quietly. "The interior walls show signs of modification. Tool marks. Someone has been enlarging that space deliberately." The shelter Kate and I discovered disappeared 3 days later. Whether removed by park services, destroyed by weather, or dismantled by whoever, or whatever, had constructed it remained unclear. Summer arrived with increased daylight hours and reduced anxiety. The motion sensors triggered less frequently. Dad's hypervigilance eased somewhat, though our family rule regarding nighttime outings remained strictly enforced. Kate prepared for her departure to college in August. I helped her pack, sorting through childhood mementos and deciding what deserved space in her dormitory room. During this process, we discussed the events of the past year with a frankness we had previously avoided. "Do you think it's gone?" I asked, folding a sweater to place in her suitcase. She considered the question thoughtfully. "I don't think it was ever really here, not completely. It exists at the periphery, where civilization meets wilderness, where light meets darkness." "That's not very scientific," I noted. Kate smiled sadly. "Not everything can be explained through scientific methodology. Some experiences defy categorization." But we both saw it. Dad saw it too. It physically injured him. "I'm not saying it wasn't real," she clarified. "I'm saying its reality might operate according to principles we don't understand." The conversation drifted to lighter topics, but Kate's perspective lingered in my thoughts. Perhaps we had encountered something that existed in the interstices of our reality, not supernatural, but natural in a way human experience rarely intersects. The night before Kate departed for college, our parents hosted a small gathering of family friends. During dinner, conversations flowed easily around topics of weather, politics, and community events. No one mentioned strange encounters or unexplained phenomena. As twilight descended, guests moved to the back patio to enjoy the mild evening air. I remained inside, observing through the sliding glass door as Dad recounted an amusing work anecdote. The normality of the scene struck me as surreal after months of heightened awareness and fear. Movement at the forest edge caught my attention, a subtle displacement of shadows beneath the trees. I watched, pulse quickening, as a figure gradually resolved from the darkness. It stood upright, impossibly thin, partially concealed behind a large oak tree. Even at this distance, I could discern its elongated head and the unnatural angles of its limbs. It observed our gathering with what felt like calculated interest. Not predatory, not threatening, but coolly analytical. When it sensed my attention, its gaze shifted toward the house, meeting my eyes through the glass door. Recognition passed between us, a moment of mutual acknowledgement. It had followed us home that night, had injured my father, had scratched at my window. Now it simply observed, as if studying our behavior for some incomprehensible purpose. I should have alerted the others. I should have pointed and screamed and drawn everyone's attention to the creature lurking at the forest's edge. Instead, I maintained its gaze until it deliberately stepped backward, melting into the deepening shadows. Kate found me still staring at the empty tree line minutes later. "Everything okay?" she asked. "It's still here," I replied quietly. "It's always been here." She followed my gaze but saw nothing unusual. "What should we do?" I considered the question carefully before answering. "Nothing. We live with the awareness. We stay vigilant. We acknowledge that our understanding of the world is incomplete." Kate nodded slowly. "And we don't walk in the woods after dark." "Especially that," I agreed. That night, as our household settled into silence, I stood at my bedroom window, looking out at the forest beyond our property. The security grate created a cross-hatched pattern across my view, a constant reminder of what lurked beyond. The motion sensor light activated briefly, illuminating the yard for 30 seconds before darkness returned. In that momentary brightness, I glimpsed a slender figure standing at the property line, motionless, watching, its raspy breathing inaudible through the glass but familiar nonetheless. I didn't alert the household. I didn't reach for my phone to document the sighting. I simply acknowledged its presence as it acknowledged mine. Whatever evolutionary branch had produced this entity had created something capable of patient observation and calculated interaction. It wasn't merely an animal, yet it wasn't human either. It existed in a classification entirely its own. The light deactivated, returning the yard to darkness. The figure remained, visible now only as a slightly deeper shadow among shadows. I knew it would continue its vigil throughout the night, just as it had for months. I closed my curtains and turned away from the window. Tomorrow, Kate would leave for college. Life would continue with its predictable rhythms and obligations, and in the woods surrounding our home, something would continue watching and waiting, studying our patterns and behaviors for reasons I might never comprehend. Whatever followed us home that night, I remain convinced it's still out there, lying in wait, observing our movements, learning our habits. Not a supernatural entity from folklore or fiction, but something that evolved alongside us, remaining hidden at the boundaries of human experience, watching, waiting, adapting. A reminder that our knowledge of the natural world remains profoundly incomplete,